Welcome to the Center Square Radio Hour for the first weekend of March 2025. I'm your host, Chris Krug. The Center Square and the Radio Hour are projects of the Franklin News Foundation, a 501c3 independent nonprofit nonpartisan news service. Established in 2019, the Center Square Newswire publishes original taxpayer-centric straight news that focuses on the size, scope, and effectiveness of local, state, and federal government. On the Center Square Radio Hour, our journalists explore their top stories, adding insight to the headlines. We'll also present thoughts on the economy from Dr. Orphe Divangi, PhD economist, and bring you the latest in K-12 education news. Today, we'll look at the budget that passed the U.S. House. We'll hear more about the financial struggles facing one Louisiana town and the state's intervention. And we'll discuss the developments from Doge. We'll be right back with all that and more in the Center Square Radio Hour.
Knowledge is power, and you deserve to know what happens in your state government. That's why the Center Square's reporting zeroes in on state authorities publishing stories that show where your money goes and who spends it. The Center Square gives power to the taxpayer by tracking politicians' use of the people's money and demanding transparency from state-run agencies. This is how the Center Square equips you, the American taxpayer, to hold your state government accountable. Sign up now for your state's Center Square newsletter at thecentersquare.com.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on the House budget, it's our Dan McCaleb. Republicans in the U.S. House this week passed a $4.5 trillion budget resolution that includes an extension of President Donald Trump's tax cuts and additional dollars for border security and national defense. The measure now heads to the Senate, where Republicans also hold a slim majority. Joining me to discuss this is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, the vote in the House was close, with Democrats opposing the budget resolution. While there are cuts in spending, the resolution would still add to the nation's debt. Tell us more.
Sure, Dan. I mean, this was a hard-fought battle for Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, who was able to, against, all odds in some sense, cobble together these votes to pass massive tax cuts, a very expensive bill, $4.5 trillion, which is kind of interesting given, the president's focus on cutting spending right now. And the Republicans have taken, some flack for that already, a criticism that they're speaking out of both sides of their mouth. But, the interesting development that came almost, soon after the House passed their bill, Dan, is the Senate has made very clear that they're not impressed with the House bill. So, and that was kind of a surprise. I mean, there were some questions about how the Senate would receive the House bill, which, is, costs a lot of money, mostly because of, it extends Trump's tax cuts and has, other tax things going on. But the Senate, is basically saying there's going to be major changes. So the Senate had previously, because the House was delaying in their mind, the Senate had passed a bill that was just like a very small bill that just kind of funded the border, funded some basic things, cost a few $100 billion and did not address the tax issue yet. And so then the House passed this bill, and some people are reporting, oh, well, it's either the Senate bill or the House bill, but that's really old news at this point. Now it is, how is the Senate going to react to this new House gigantic bill? And a few things we're hearing from senators, though it varies, is, one, a lot of senators, including Senator Thune, who's now really leading Republicans in the Senate, they want to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. And that's a really big deal. They don't want to just extend them. They want to make them permanent. And so that's going to be expensive. It might take away from other tax, cuts that people wanted to make to focus just on the Trump tax cuts, which were first passed in the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So they want to make those permanent. And then there's there's concern about, paying for everything. And so can they do more? They want to do some senators want to do more cuts to spending to help pay for these tax cuts. But at the same time, there's a lot of senators who are very worried about cuts to Medicaid, which is going to be one of the main ways to pay for this. And so, my read on this, Dan, is this is going to be a gnarly battle. Republicans have, about 2 weeks till the government shuts down. And right now, it seems like it's going to be a lot of long nights for the legislative staffers on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, Casey, the national debt is at more than $36.5 trillion. Those who closely follow government spending and the national debt and the annual budget deficits have been warning for years that U.S. debt is unsustainable. Of course, President Donald Trump created the Department of Government Efficiency to help tax cuts, but because the budget deficits under Joe Biden grew to more than $2 trillion, there is a lot of work to do here. And this Republican House resolution would only add to the debt, add to the budget deficits, although it does include some cuts, a number of cuts. When your debt gets that big, this is hard, right? There are no easy solutions without massive budget cuts. So Republicans, which have slim majorities in both the House and the Senate, have a lot of work to do to get there.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think because we've been in deficits for so long, we don't have a realistic picture of what the U.S. can actually afford without being in deficit. We're so used to deficit spending that we have this sense of like how much it costs to run the country. And maybe if we trim a little here, trim a little there, but we've been in $1 trillion deficits for a while. And then ever since COVID, we've been in multi-trillion, over somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion, sometimes over 2 trillion, over the last 5 years. And so when you talk about, we can cut, $100, $1 million of waste from Medicaid or something. It's really, of course we want to do that, but it's a drop in the bucket to the bigger picture. And really the U.S. can only afford to pay for basically our entitlement programs and national defense. And that's about it. And so all this other discretionary spending, all these other programs, these agencies that we pay for it's all deficit spending. A huge percentage of our spending is deficit spending. And that's creating the other problem, which we've talked about on this podcast, which is, interest on the national debt is on track to be our biggest expense in the country, more than, defense, more than Medicaid, more than Medicare, more than we spend on anything. That's how if you think of a household. If you're paying more interest on your credit cards than you are paying for your mortgage, that's the definition of bankrupt.
And the quantity here too, though, you mentioned the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 under the first the first Trump administration. That has a sunset, and that sunset is many parts of that has a sunset, and that is this year. So either the dilemma is that either taxpayers across the United States are going to see pretty significant tax hikes if it's not extended, or if it is extended, that's going to add to the budget deficit, unless they can find enough spending cuts to pay for the tax cuts. Casey, we're almost out of time. Final word.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And just to put some fine points on this, the minimum deduction is going to go down if these expire, for instance. And another big one is, I believe the child tax credit is going to be cut, I think, in half. It's going to be a big cut to the child tax credit. So these are not just tax cuts, for businesses or, billionaires, as some Democrats have said. This is going to impact everyone. This is going to impact, the taxes that everyone, your average American is filing. So it's a tough decision. These are not, all capital gains reforms or something. These are things that are going to impact every American. But of course, the deficit is a huge problem. It's gone unaddressed. And it's more and more looking like this year it's not going to get addressed either, Dan.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com. A big thanks to Dan and Casey. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. With more on Bogalusa, Louisiana, it's Eliana Kernodle.
The Louisiana Fiscal Review Committee has placed the town of Bogalusa under the control of a fiscal administrator, citing severe financial distress. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's Nolan McKendry. Nolan, what does this mean for the town of Bogalusa?
Well, in short, it means that Bogalusa's financial troubles have reached a breaking point. A state-appointed fiscal administrator will now take control of the town's finances. He'll make key budgetary decisions. He'll oversee expenditures and just generally work to stabilize the city's finances. He'll look for unfunded liabilities and debts owed and just try to find out what's missing. He'll have a great deal of authority, and he'll be able to reduce payroll for city officials and employees, and he'll be able to renegotiate debts, all in an effort to keep the city afloat.
The town's financial problems aren't new. What's the history here?
That's right. The city has been struggling for years with their finances. Back in 2019, the state placed Bogalusa under a fiscal administrator due to similar concerns. And in 2019, that administrator served until 2021, at which point control of the finances was returned to the mayor and the city council, provided that they follow a 3-year fiscal recovery plan, which included steps like reducing payroll costs and improving financial reporting. But according to the Louisiana legislative auditor, those obligations were not fully implemented, and that failure to implement those has contributed to the current crisis.
What are some of those specific examples of their shaky finances?
Yeah, the numbers are quite staggering for a city of just 10,000 people. In 2019, the auditor found that the city was operating in a deficit of over $32 million, which was largely attributed to pensions. In 2022, before the previous mayor left office, but after the fiscal administration had been completed, the Louisiana legislative auditor found that illegal bonus payments were given to city employees totaling almost $500,000 using money received from the American Rescue Plan. Today, the city's cash reserves have plummeted. Outstanding debts have accrued, and the local government has again failed to meet its obligations. Currently, the city's net position isn't certain, hence the fiscal administration. But we do know that the city's cash balance dropped from $6.7 million at the start of 2024 to just $3.42 million by the year's end. They currently owe over $1 million in unpaid payroll taxes to the IRS, and another $273,000 to the state. Vendor payments totaling around $600,000 are past due, and the city has roughly $10 million in outstanding payables. On top of that, the city's water bond accounts are underfunded, and payroll tax payments have been inconsistent, which has led to penalties and interest charges that have accrued over time. They're also behind on financial reporting, with audits from almost 3 years ago still incomplete, which is preventing them from accessing state funds. Now, as I said, the fiscal administrator has just been appointed, so it's not entirely clear what other discrepancies might be found. But it is likely that, more issues will arise.
What have members of the city council said on the matter?
There's a clear sense of urgency, no doubt. Councilmember Gloria Gates, I believe, said that outside help is needed to fix these issues for, the good of the city. The mayor also welcomed the fiscal administration, and in December, the city council unanimously voted to request a fiscal administrator. Councilmember Mark Irvine, who I've spoken with personally, has been very vocal about what he sees as a mismanagement of priorities, pointing to, in particular, the city's failing sewer infrastructure. He expressed, a great deal of frustration that while funds have been allocated for parks and, other projects, pressing issues like, sewage, the sewage system failures are being neglected. And another council member noted that financial records have been difficult to access, specifically on these credit cards that are given to city employees. And so a lot of concern has been raised about transparency and accountability.
The mayor was recently arrested. How does that play into this story?
That's right. Mayor Tyrin Truong, who took office in 2023 at the age of 23, was arrested recently on charges related to drug trafficking and prostitution. The mayor denies the allegations, and he's even called them racially and politically motivated. But the city council has kind of painted a different story about him, or of him. They've said that the mayor has been very difficult to work with and has at times been acrimonious towards the city council. Although it's unclear if charges are being sought for Truong, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality has begun a criminal investigation into the neglect of the city's sewage system. Over the past 3 or so years, untreated sewage has been leaking into people's homes and yards, onto streets, and perhaps most dangerously into state waters. One leak allowed 1,300 gallons of sewage to leak. And that leak occurred just yards away from a creek that feeds right into the Pearl River, which spans some 477 miles across Mississippi and Louisiana. However, inspectors indicated that the leak did not contaminate the river. That leak, the one that allowed 1,300 gallons of sewage out, actually occurred 1 month ago today after the city had been issued a compliance order from the Louisiana Department of Health, which required them to take immediate action in relation to their sewage system. So there's a pattern of mismanagement and neglect in the city that is very troublesome, and it certainly implicates the mayor.
Well, Nolan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Nolan. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on the ongoing efforts to cut the federal government and the challenges Doge is facing. It's our Dan McCaleb.
Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency continue to make headlines with mass layoffs in the federal bureaucracy and Democrats warning of the potential fallout. But many Americans support the expense cut efforts. Joining me to discuss this today is Casey Harper, Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Center Square. Casey, what's the latest on Doge?
Oh, Doge is rip-roaring and ripping through, federal spending on a daily basis, and it's hitting some legal roadblocks along the way. So what we've seen from Doge, which is actually, I started to say it's led by Elon Musk, the billionaire, but there's even questions about who exactly is leading it because the White House has really sort of dodged the question. But of course, Musk is the face of Doge. He's got the ear of the president and is almost daily announcing new decisions, new cuts, new wasteful spending that he's identified. He helped lead the charge to gut almost, this looks, the AP reported, 90% cuts to U.S. aid, our foreign, aid agency. And so, he's been up to that. We saw, he sent out that very controversial note to federal employees requiring them to say 5 things they did last week, which caused, mass chaos in the government. 1, I think fear. People just had fear, about it. And then 2, there were some agency heads who told their employees to disregard the message. And then we have like judges who are starting to kind of slow down these things, to challenge the rulings or to stop the firings. So, it raises the question, what's happening here? I think there's a few things. 1, there's a real question about who has the authority to do what in the federal government and what is the limit of Elon Musk's authority. And so I think the administration has kind of fumbled a little bit in just thinking they could cut through the line, kind of go around the normal lines of authority and just send out emails and memos from the Office of Management Budget or from OPM or from Elon and get things done. But the federal government is very regimented. It's very, you could say it's organized. In some sense, it's very disorganized, but it has clear lines of command and communication. And the White House, I think, tried to not use those or just in such a hurry they didn't use them. And so it's created some legal problems for them, including a judge this week who halted the mass layoffs, some of the mass firings at some of the agencies. So that's one thing, is who has the authority to do what. I think the White House is going to have to kind of reissue or refire some people using the right person to fire them, basically the agency head or whoever it is. Then another thing that's going on here is there are these union contracts that the Biden, some of them pre-existed, but the Biden administration negotiated these contracts with government unions, and some of them are pretty cushy. I mean, about like coming into work or not firing people. It's infamously difficult to fire federal employees, right? And we're seeing some of that now, but there's a question of how much are the hands of the Trump administration tied by these union contracts that the Biden administration negotiated. And so the federal union is pretty strong. It's got almost 1 million members and it's suing over all these things. And so there's, all these flurry of lawsuits from the government union that are slowing everything down, challenging it. I've read through some of the documents and it looks like, the judges are at least open to these challenges. So, it's more complicated than just saying the president can fire everyone. They're trying to move quickly, so they've run into some hiccups. Ultimately, I think they'll succeed in, being able to fire some people and make some big cuts, but it's a lot more complicated than maybe they expected.
And Congress's involvement is noteworthy as well, Casey. While much of the focus in the news on Doge has been these expense cuts, Doge is also charged with cutting government regulations on businesses and other things. You wrote this week, though, that the president has the authority to only do so many things. Congress would need to get involved to make some of these cuts, both in expenses and in government regulations, more permanent. Tell us about that.
That's right. The experts I'm talking to who support Trump's reforms are saying this is great, but this is temporary, and this is not really getting down to the root of the issue. So they see it as a good start. But, for instance, you can cut funding to the Department of Education, but the Department of Education has thousands of regulations that are still legally binding on the books. And so until either one by one, or you could pass a law to, really undo a lot of that or supersede it. But it would take Congress, to really quickly say, these 1,000 regulations are no longer in effect somehow. Just defunding the agency doesn't do that. They're still binding law. And, also these agencies, an agency is not just, one government office building, with, Department of Education on the door. I mean, in some of the bigger agencies, there's many sub departments with their own office buildings. And so, the agencies have sort of metastasized and spread their roots out, and they're everywhere. And so to really track down where the money is going, who's hired where, it is a big job. And, I think it's going to be very hard for Trump to do this without Congress. And then, of course, Dan, as soon as a new president comes in, if it's a Democrat or a Republican who's just more moderate, they can undo many of Trump's actions with the stroke of a pen.
And of course, Republicans do have majorities in both the House and the Senate, but they're the slimmest of majorities. So, any Republican defections can essentially put roadblocks on the long-term efforts to cut government spending and cut government over regulation. Do the Republicans in both the House and the Senate, are they united enough to get stuff like this done?
I think right now they're not focused on this issue. They're pretty distracted. They are trying to figure out how to keep the government from shutting down in a couple of weeks. And right now they're not agreeing at all. I think that Trump still has the political will and the power to get something done to rally the Republicans. I think there would be some political appetite for some kind of big bad, government spending, government waste, cutting bill where they really trim some of these agencies down. Now, if they're smart, they'll try to get that stuff into this new funding bill to help offset these tax cuts they want to pass. But I don't know if they're going to have time to do that. And also really, if they're going to make really substantial cuts, they're going to have to cut into some big entitlement programs or defense spending, which is going to be really unpopular among some Republicans who are just not going to be willing to do it. So I think that, the smaller agency trimming down, probably easy, cutting the actual entitlements that need to be addressed and reforming them to deal with the big deficit problem. I'll believe it when I see it.
Thank you for joining us today, Casey. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thanks to Dan and Casey for that update. After the break, we'll look at more top stories from across the nation. Will California restrict self-defense? Can President Trump abolish the Department of Education? And do tax cuts pay for themselves? We'll have all that and more when we return on the Center Square Radio Hour. Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. Here are this week's quick hits, some of the original reporting that you may have missed at thecentersquare.com. Vivek Ramaswamy, one-time Republican candidate for president, formally announced his candidacy for governor of Ohio on Monday afternoon. Ramaswamy said he will campaign on business growth, education, an embrace of capitalism and meritocracy, deregulation, and enhancing innovation in aerospace and artificial intelligence. Ramaswamy, 39, joins a primary field for the 2026 cycle that includes State Attorney General Dave Yost and Morgan County Board of Education President Heather Hill. Lieutenant Governor Jim Tressel, a 72-year-old chosen by term-limited Governor Mike DeWine to fill the remainder of now Senator John Huston's term as lieutenant governor, is being watched for his potential plans. President Donald Trump and billionaire advisor Elon Musk endorsed Ramaswamy shortly after he announced. Apple announced Monday plans to invest more than $500 billion in the U.S. over the next 4 years, its largest ever spend commitment. The company included some specific plans in its announcement, including opening a new 250,000 square foot server manufacturing facility in Houston that will support Apple Intelligence. It's also planning to open a new manufacturing academy in Detroit to spur the economy there and support the growth of advanced manufacturing in the United States. The legality of President Donald Trump's ban on automatic birthright citizenship hinges on a single phrase in the 14th Amendment, and lawmakers are divided on its correct interpretation. Republicans and Democrats sparred during a U.S. House Judiciary Committee meeting Tuesday over the meaning of the phrase, quote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, end quote, within the Constitution's citizenship clause, which states that, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States, end quote. Republican lawmakers argued that jurisdiction does not simply mean territorial jurisdiction, but full and complete jurisdiction requiring allegiance to the U.S. government. They argued the writers of the 14th Amendment never meant to include illegal immigrants and tourists who come to the U.S. explicitly to have children, only American citizens. Democrats argued that the 14th Amendment has been interpreted for over a decade to mean anyone who is born in the United States automatically becomes a citizen, regardless of the immigration status of the parents. U.S. Senator Marsha Blackburn, a Republican from Tennessee, is calling for newly confirmed FBI Director Kash Patel and U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi to release the complete unredacted files related to Jeffrey Epstein, the wealthy New York man of mystery accused of international sex trafficking who died in police custody in 2019. Blackburn also sent a letter to Internal Revenue Service Acting Commissioner Douglas O'Donnell calling for Epstein-related records. Epstein has been at the center of swirling rumors and a symbol of government secrecy, as files related to his clients and his death had remained hidden. Patel has publicly pushed for transparency and indicated he would help bring transparency to the Epstein case. Wisconsin voters will decide on April 1st whether liberal Judge Susan Crawford or conservative Judge Brad Schimmel will join the state Supreme Court with the balance of power on the line. If Schimmel wins, the court will flip back to a 5-4 conservative majority. There are stark differences between the two candidates. Crawford has faced criticism for her time on the bench in Madison and some of the lighter sentences she's given to violent criminal offenders. And while Schimmel supports Wisconsin's voter ID law, Crawford has publicly opposed it. You can find more on these stories and others like them from across the country at thecentersquare.com. We'll be right back with more on the Center Square Radio Hour.
He ran for state office and was beaten. Started a business and failed. Ran for Congress and lost. But thankfully, Abraham Lincoln didn't give up. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Are you tired of news that puts politics over people? At the nonprofit Franklin News Foundation, we believe in putting people over politics by delivering nonpartisan news and audio content that serves you, the American taxpayer. With Franklin News Foundation, you can read fact-based, state-focused news for free at thecentersquare.com. You can listen to civil, balanced conversations between policy experts through our podcast network at americastalking.com. Or you can get in-depth news on K-12 education spending, curriculum, and school safety at chalkboardnews.com. It's all free through Franklin, where we put you, the American taxpayer, first in every story, episode, and conversation. And it's only possible through our supporters. Together, we can produce content that puts people over politics and brings Americans the news they deserve. Become a supporter today at franklinnews.org/donate. Once again, that's franklinnews.org/donate.
Welcome back to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm Chris Krug. With more on a California bill that limits what victims and bystanders can do out of self-defense, it's our Eliana Kernodle.
California lawmakers have proposed a bill restricting self-defense. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, what is in this bill?
Hey, Eliana, this is a really odd bill. These California lawmakers proposed restricting self-defense, but by mandating retreat, so you have a duty to try retreating Otherwise, you can be tried for homicide. So this will also end crime stopping protections. Historically, there have been protections where if you are trying to maintain the peace, you're trying to stop a felony, you're trying to protect someone or their property, you may not have to be charged with homicide. Unfortunately, this bill would eliminate that protection, which would really increase the liability you could face for trying to help someone in danger if you accidentally hurt someone. It would also require you to only use force that is, quote, reasonably necessary. So if you're found to have used more force than possibly needed to put down or prevent a threat, then you also could face that higher legal threshold and end up in prison. Crucially, this bill would eliminate your ability to defend yourself in a standard ground fashion when you're defending your own property. It says that you would no longer be justified in killing a person if you are just defending property or habitation. At least that's what it says in the bill summary. This is sort of a foundation to self-defense in this country, the ability to defend your own home. So there was a lot of backlash against this.
And what are people saying about this bill, particularly the author and some of the supporters?
Well, let's first talk about what the supporters say, because that'll lead into what the author does think. The supporters of the bill, Everytown for Gun Safety, was one of the organizations that immediately put out a statement support. This is a gun control group. They said that this bill would block white supremacists from exploiting self-defense to justify shootings. And let me read you a quote from them. They said, "White supremacists and other extremists have hidden behind self-defense laws to fire a gun and turn any conflict into a death sentence. We thank Assemblymember Zabur for his commitment to gun safety." So let's go ahead and actually take a look at what Zabur said after the national backlash to this law. He said, "AB 1333 was never intended to limit a crime victim's right to defend yourself, your family, or your home. The goal is to prevent wannabe vigilantes like Kyle Rittenhouse from provoking violence and claiming self-defense after the fact. We will amend the bill to make this crystal clear." This quote is interesting because it doesn't really seem to reflect an understanding of what the bill says, because this bill does create a right of someone who instigates violence to defend themselves from defenders who make them feel unsafe, like they are about to die. So it's very interesting that he would say that, given that the bill does create this ability for defense for instigators.
So this kind of reminds me of the famous case with in New York with Daniel Penny, someone stepping in to try to address someone who seemed like a threat. How would this bill impact a situation like that?
If you are a bystander and this bill is passed and you decide to get involved, you could find yourself in prison. Daniel Penny was one of several men who held down the individual who died on the train. This mandate to retreat could have been invoked to say that anyone who was on the train could have just gotten out of there. Penny was a no threat. There was no risk of harm to Penny, so maybe he could have just retreated. Maybe other people on the train could have just retreated to another part of the train, and that none of this was necessary.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.
Thank you, Eliana and Kenneth. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Back with more on making lasting changes at the Department of Education. It's our Casey Harper.
The Department of Education is in danger. Some people are talking about cutting it all together. Is that a good idea? Here to help us understand is David Randall. He's the Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars. David, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Sure. So I think some are fantasizing about Elon Musk taking one of his famous flamethrowers and standing outside of the Department of Education and maniacally laughing as employees are escorted out as he takes a metaphorical flamethrower to the whole place. But, I've been covering DC for a while. I suspect it's not that easy. You and your organization released a lengthy, very thorough report on what does it actually look like to make cuts and reformations in the federal education space. So let me ask you, what does the landscape look like for Trump as this idea of reforming the Department of Education actually goes into reality?
I want to look ahead, not just for what's done under President Trump, but to make sure that the reforms of the education department endure, even if a president with different priorities assumes power in Washington. That means that executive orders are wonderful, but if you don't get rid of the underlying statute law, the education department could spring back to life as horrible as ever. So our report focuses on a variety of reforms, but it includes recommendations for the statutory reforms you need to make sure that everything that is done wonderfully by Elon Musk and company now endures beyond just one or even two administrations.
Right. So lay out, I think the average American has their own idea of what the Department of Education may be doing wrong. I think there's questions about discrimination. There's, questions about waste and abuse and why all this money goes all the way to DC just to be sent back to the states to spend. So what are the line items, legislation that are going to make the biggest impact so that whatever Trump reforms are done in this Trump administration actually live beyond him?
The education department has 4 big spending areas, and that's Title I spending for disadvantaged school districts, special education funding for handicapped children, Pell Grants providing money for disadvantaged students, and then student loans for every college student who applies for them. There's then dozens and dozens of smaller programs, which, only billions and billions of dollars, but much less than the big 4. But the thing is that bound up with that, the education department has this massive regulatory labyrinth, which subordinates all the, school districts and states to the education department in Washington. And most to the point, this weaponized use of civil rights law above all to impose this radical political agenda on, the states, the school districts, on America. What the Trump administration has done in terms of getting rid of DEI already is wonderful, although there are some deeper changes that need to be made, like getting rid of disparate impact theory, full court. You also need to have massive financial reform, as they are contemplating, to make sure you can't use, this weaponization of civil rights law as a hammer blow to all the education departments and colleges. And then, as I say, you need to make that endure by the statutory reform that will make sure that the education department will never have that leverage over America's schools again.
Right. So I think this is a really important point. And I'm glad we have you on, because I don't hear anyone really talking about this, which is you can cut spending all you want. And I think a lot of Americans are cheering on the cutting of wasteful spending. But agencies don't just spend money. Actually, the main thing they do is make rules, and they make a lot of rules, and they make them almost every day. And you can cut funding for grants and for different employees, but those rules could still be on the books. And that doesn't even address maybe the laws that are written that gave life to those rules. And so I really think a lot of Americans would be amazed to know the wide, the authority and the discretion that these agencies have to make new rules that basically act as laws. For example, during the Biden administration, the Department of Education reinterpreted longstanding Title IX and how it was read. And they just redefined what the words in Title IX meant to suit a sort of political agenda. And and they just did it. And that shows you what they are capable of. And so, do you think that's a clear picture? Of course, cutting spending is clear, but what are those regulations? What does it look like to rewrite those regulations? Is that possible? Because it's such a long process to get new regulations. Is it unreasonable to think that 4 years of this administration is long enough to really do away with all these rules and things that have built up over decades?
You need 20 years. It's going to need President Trump and, a President Vance and a President DeSantis, just to idly pick two names following up. You can start immediately by saying you cannot use dear colleague letters, to enforce major policy changes, which is this great abuse from the Obama years onwards. To say that you cannot use case resolutions to enforce massive policy. And what this means is the education department, it threatens a university or a school with, legal action. The school or university often quite voluntarily says, okay, we'll make a massive local, diversity, repression and, discrimination bureaucracy. And that will satisfy you. And the education department says yes. And then every other university or school district in the country says, oh, we better do this to be on the right side of the education department. It's all technically legal and it's all technically doesn't require statute, but it's obviously the education department usurping the role of Congress. And I might say creating what is now at least as dangerous as the education department's bureaucracy, all these distributed bureaucracies of discriminatory and repressive activists in every local education administration in the country.
David, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Casey and David. You're listening to the Center Square Radio Hour. I'm your host, Chris Krug. Joining me to discuss the cost of tax cuts is PhD economist Dr. Orphe Divounguy. Dr. O, you and I were talking about show ideas this week, and you were like, hey, we should do something on fuzzy math. Talk to me about fuzzy math.
Yeah, no, totally. I saw this really interesting article in Bloomberg with a quote from Allison, who's a economic policy expert from the Manhattan Institute. And look, and it talked about, it was entitled Fuzzy Math. And and it said, President Donald Trump is throwing his support behind a House budget plan that would include a $4.5 trillion tax cut. Mm-hmm. I love tax cuts. I'm doing my taxes this week. I think a lot of you are dealing with taxes.
Yeah. It's tax time.
I love tax cuts. But here's the catch. That number should raise some eyebrows amid concerns about U.S. massive debt and deficits. But the Trump administration, the Trump government insists that we can deliver tax cuts and meaningful deficit reductions simultaneously. Mm-hmm. No trade-offs necessary.
Oh, you're quoting from that.
I'm just reading this article. I'm not, this is not my opinion. This is just, right. I'm reading this article. And Allison wrote, none of this is likely. And here's what she says. Yes, the government needs to cut waste and excessive regulations, and some tax cuts will boost growth. We agree there. But even in the best case scenario, the added growth wouldn't be enough to make them pay for themselves, let alone cover the unfunded entitlements coming due in the next decade.
Well, let me put the question back to you, because you've driven us to the question. Do tax cuts pay for themselves? If so, how?
They don't. They don't. I mean, there's a great study, 2005, I think, study by Greg Menke, the legend in macroeconomics. I call him a legend because his stuff got me interested in this subject matter. Mm-hmm. And Greg was actually, worked, for the Bush 2, administration, great economist. And his paper and co-authors found that tax cuts could pay for between 15 and 32% of their initial cost. In other words, they don't pay for themselves. You could get a little bit of growth over the long run, over time, right? You get a little stimulus over time, but and that helps make up for some of the lost tax revenue. But you can't get, best case scenario, you get maybe 1/3 of the losses back. Okay. And so you end up with higher deficits. Okay. And there's another great paper, 2014 paper that says the concluded tax cuts might not produce in any significant economic growth. And this is the extreme, the extreme paper that says no, not whatsoever, because it results in higher debt. Yeah. Higher deficits and higher debt. We agree there. The CBO itself had this paper, the study that showed, 10% cut in the individual income tax could, result in 28%, could result in basically, recovering about 28% of the lost revenue, but would further increase deficits slightly due to the negative economic impact of higher deficits.
Yeah. So what does that mean? So if you're going to make it can't be tax cuts alone. So there has to be, what are the other mechanisms that have to come along with the tax?
If you're going to cut taxes and you don't want higher deficits, you're going to have to make some significant spending cuts at the same time. And so that is kind of the economics. That's the math.
But isn't that what Stephen Miller's talking about? And isn't that in line with the Doge concept? I mean, it's that like if the USAID is gone and gone forever, and we're never going to put another penny into that pocket, right? Have we not made a permanent cut for which we will never have to fund?
Look, Doge is trimming around the edges, mate. We're not talking about Social Security.
Well, it better not be. I don't think we're
what I'm saying, like Allison suggested, there are massive unfunded entitlements coming due in the next decade. And we got to seriously think about that. Especially if you want your mortgage rates to come down.
That's certainly an important factor. And I mean, not just mortgage rates, but interest rates in general.
Exactly. And that's where we're at right now. And so that's why, as interesting, I think it's great that we're having these conversations. I think it's great to have more people in the mix talking about, policy. But we got to be very careful. And that's why I think, waiting, trying different things, but waiting, seeing what the impact is going to be before going out and doing and throwing, everything at the wall and waiting to see what happens. I think that's a dangerous way of doing policy. And so we got to be careful. We got to operate with surgical precision. We cannot be throwing things out there and hoping something will stick and hoping something will fix the problem. We got to go at it, carefully with really good research, if we want the outcome to be, the intended outcome.
Appreciate your thoughts as always, Dr. Rowe. That'll do it for another week of the Center Square Radio Hour. If you missed some of today's show, you can find it wherever you find podcasts. I'm Chris Krug on behalf of everyone at Franklin News Foundation. Thank you for listening to the Center Square Radio Hour.